Hi, everyone. My name is Cheryl Cohen. I'm with Arthritis Consumer Experts, and I am so happy to be here today with you on Arthritis at Home with someone who should be familiar to you, Ms. Maya Joshi, who was the former programs coordinator at Arthritis Consumer Experts and someone who was leading the charge in our work on equity in health. So welcome, Maya, back to the program.
Thanks. It's great to be back.
Yeah. Listen, we know you're a busy woman. You're getting ready to sort of complete it. I know an intense program that you've been taking over the summer. And the reason we have dragged you back here, I hope not kicking and screaming, is to talk about your recently published paper. I believe your first published paper.
Yes,
Yay! High five. For our audience, Maya, information, you're a person living with rheumatoid arthritis, relatively sort of, I don't want to say a newbie, but you're early in your journey compared to myself, 31 years. And your field of study has been in the sociology department at UBC. And your article was published in the journal called Sojourners. And I just love the name of the journal. And it's an undergraduate sociology journal. Can you kind of provide for us a brief overview of what your paper is on and why you chose to write on the subject, which is about inequity in patient communication between provider and patient? So I maybe give us the full name of your title. And tell us just sort of high level what your paper is about.
Yeah, for sure. So my paper is called Unequal Treatment, the Impact of Social Position on Patient-Provider Interactions. And so social position refers to our multiple identities that we hold in the social world. So race, class, gender, disability status, age, so on. It's a big term.
Yeah.
So I wrote this paper originally for a class I was taking at UBC called the Sociology of Health and Illness. And then I worked on it some more and submitted it to this journal. But during the time that I was originally working on it was around the same period that myself and Graham Reed from the Canadian Spondylitis Association were working on a special issue of Joint Health Insight for ACE's Health and Equity series. We were looking specifically at the experiences of Indigenous peoples within Canadian healthcare. And we had so many great conversations while working on it. So it sort of prompted me to expand on this topic for my paper and dig more deeply into the issue using an intersectional lens for the paper, because of course, our experiences as patients are really complex. They're shaped by more than just, our race, but also class status and gender. So yeah, my paper looks at how race, class, and gender and the effects of all three of them combined impact interactions with healthcare providers. And to do this, I examined Canadian news media, existing research on the subject, and used some sociological theory.
Very cool. There's a lot of big words in that brief overview. And for our lay audience, what we want you to do for us is provide us some highlights, kind of unpack for us, if you will, Maya, what your findings were and the impact of specifically race on patient provider interactions. I mean, we know how important that interaction is in our lives living with arthritis.
My research of existing research did focus on the Canadian healthcare system, so this will all be specific to that. But essentially, there's a lot of research showing that patients are treated differently in healthcare based on their race. And of course, this shouldn't be much of a surprise. ACE themselves have published a lot of work on the subject. So yeah, I'll just give some examples of studies that really stood out to me. So one of them, which was published here in BC recently, found that 84% of Indigenous respondents had experienced some form of discrimination within the province's healthcare system, within British Columbia. And the way that this discrimination manifested is were generally assumptions made about the patient by the provider. So some of this includes being labeled as less worthy of care in comparison to white patients, being assumed to have substance use dependency disorder, meaning being seen as having drug use issues or substance use issues, having ulterior motives for wanting pain medication, or being accused of misusing or overusing the healthcare system. So of course, these are all really harmful assumptions. And if providers hold these assumptions, which the study suggested that they did, of course, this is going to impact the type of treatment that patients receive. And these issues have led to countless events captured in news media over the last decade, if not more, of Indigenous patients dying in the ER waiting rooms, not even being seen, waiting there. One man, Brian Sinclair, was left for 34 hours and then died of a treatable bladder infection, being misdiagnosed, or not having the time taken to actually run diagnostic tests, and not having concerns being taken seriously. So that is sort of a snapshot of that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously not the happiest of papers to read, but the reality. And I think that's where we're at in this country is people stepping up and actually speaking about the reality that our fellow human beings are experiencing in the healthcare system. What are some of your key findings regarding the impact of gender? Which is really, I know it's going to be interesting. I know what you will say is going to be interesting. I've read the paper, which we're going to provide at the end, by the way, a link to the paper.
Yeah, so, gender, this was really interesting. And of course, as a woman myself, I can, unfortunately could relate to some of these findings. So overall, the big key message is that female patients are taken less seriously compared to male patients. One study found that half of all women that were surveyed have experienced symptoms being diminished or overlooked by a physician. And this is usually sort of rooted in stereotypes about the overly sensitive or hysterical woman. So what research has found and suggests is that healthcare providers are more likely to question the credibility of female patients, to see them as too emotional, or see that they're only experiencing pain in their heads. So as a result of these biases, research suggests that physicians are less likely to admit women who are in pain for medical testing, are more likely to diagnose their pain as psychological in origin, so in their head, and tend to give women less pain medication than men. And of course, this is all very paradoxical, considering the fact that women are more likely to suffer from chronic pain conditions, such as some forms of arthritis.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I believe they're more likely to actually go and seek out medical care for issues they're having with their health. So talk about your paradoxical situation here is we're actually going there saying there's something wrong at a higher rate than men do. We're not acknowledged for having taken the action to look after our health and take steps to address a health concern. In fact, we're penalized for that.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah.
Like I think, an experience that I've personally had, I have to say, first of all, that, my rheumatology team is amazing. This is not at all directed to that, specifically experiences in emergency rooms.
Yeah.
I've experienced really having to fight for concerns to be taken seriously in a way that doesn't feel like the same thing would happen if it was
a man.
Yeah.
Status. So you've talked about race, you've talked about gender. Now kind of tease out for us a bit more what class and socioeconomic status do to this interaction.
For sure. So just a sort of a preemptive thing before we get into class is to think of, after having talked about race and gender, that it's really important then to consider the experience of racialized women. So women who are Black, Indigenous, or a person of color, because then you're experiencing, the overlapping impacts of gender biases and race biases. And so your experience is going to be different from, and more negative then, or you're more likely to have a negative experience as a racialized woman. So what's really interesting about class is that it can either act as a buffer against racism and sexism, so meaning that it can actually like prevent that experience from happening, or it can exacerbate it and make it worse.
So someone who's at a higher socioeconomic status, that would be a buffer.
Yeah.
And someone in a lower socioeconomic status, that would be something that would exacerbate the racism and the sexism.
Exactly. That's exactly it. So wealth, or I guess more importantly here, the appearance of wealth, since, a lot of this is based on, making quick sort of decisions or assumptions about people, what they look like.
Right.
So the appearance of wealth is associated with credibility in healthcare settings. So for example, one piece of research showed that, so as we know, and I sort of talked about this under the gender category, patients who display distress and emotion, particularly women, are less likely to be taken seriously. But research shows that the impacts of this distress are reduced if the patients are visibly higher SES. So like a higher level of education and income are associated with more credibility.
Right.
And then just an example for race, because I think it's just as important to consider when looking at racism in healthcare. I'll give an example because I think it's most powerful from firsthand accounts. There was a young Indigenous woman in Canada who was interviewed for a study, and she said that whenever she goes to the hospital, she dresses up like she's going to church. So what I took from this is that if she signals a professional middle-class identity, she's more likely to have positive interactions with healthcare providers.
Instead of just being herself, not having that pressure, walking in, not having to kind of perform in a way, right?
Yeah.
To put on a different exterior almost than what she might otherwise choose to or wish to carry. How do we address? I mean, we're not looking to you as a almost close to graduating her undergrad to solve all these problems, but you've had some really great insights and learned so much and have taught us so much through your research in this paper. What do we do? How do we address this stuff?
Yeah, so I think one of the most important things is an awareness and general acknowledgement for implicit biases, because we all have them. Everyone, this isn't just like a healthcare provider related issue at all. This is something that we all have. And implicit biases can sort of be understood as mental shortcuts that we use to make quick decisions about how to interact with people based on really small amounts of information. So like what people are wearing, how they speak, how we perceive their gender, their race. And we all do this. You meet somebody,
Sure.
You go into a meeting, somebody's dressed a certain way, you think, okay, this person looks really proper. I'm going to interact with them in this way because this seems like what I should do based on my beliefs and understanding of who this person is. So as I said, yeah, we all use mental shortcuts, but they're really harmful, not only when they're incorrect, which they often are based on racist and sexist ideologies that we might have grown up with, but also specifically when they're used by people in positions of power, which includes healthcare providers. Because healthcare providers, as we know as patients, are really important people in our lives. They're make it or break it folks. They determine our ability to access testing. For example, when we first came with arthritis symptoms, healthcare providers, listened to us, gave us the ability to do some more testing and diagnose us with rheumatoid arthritis. But if a healthcare provider has an implicit bias, it impacts our ability to get that testing, to get access to medication. They really act as important gatekeepers in the life of patients. So that's what makes that bias so harmful.
Yeah, as I'm listening to you speak, Maya, I'm thinking about the delay to diagnosis, particularly in ankylosing spondyloarthritis. And there is a significant difference between men and women in terms of the time it takes them. And both of them are tragically too long, as you know. But women, it's even longer. And I can't help but think that this gender bias that you're talking about is part of the problem. That women are coming in talking about malingering pain. They can't in the back or in the hips. For women, it's often can be not axial related, but hips, joints at the peripheral joints. And they're just not being taken seriously. They're just not heard in the same way that a man talking about his symptom experience or profile is taken. So I'm sure you can probably think through all of the different types of arthritis. There are over 100, of course, that you know a lot about, and can find some of this research in our own setting, in our own house, so to speak, the arthritis house.
Certainly. In fact, there was an interview that Cheryl, I think you did a couple of years ago at the CRA with Dr. Betty Diamond, I think, and she spoke to this and the history of lupus and the history of lupus getting recognized. And one of the reasons it took so long was it was young women experiencing.
Right.
So, yeah, no, so relevant.
And young women, very powerless, actually. When you look at power, the older you get, the more you learn, the more experienced you are in communication. And when you're a young woman, you're just trying to figure things out, and to go in and talk about things that normally you would hear older women or even older men talk about. It must seem foreign. I know it's foreign to their friends. We hear this all the time from our members with lupus who really struggle to say, these are women who are at high school, they're 14, 15, 16, 17 years old, trying to explain to their network of friends. I mean, you've been through this yourself, being diagnosed while you were in high school with rheumatoid arthritis, that is. But this is just such fascinating work. I almost feel like we should just print a placard, and when we walk into a medical office, say, don't judge me by any of the things you're looking at right now. Open your heart, open your ears. I'm a human being, and let me tell you my story.
Without judgments.
Without judgment.
Yeah.
It is almost like you have to kind of wear that card on your forehead or something, or on your lapel, so that those, as you call them, instant judgments, the cues, these shortcuts we take in communication, which are, as we've learned from you, can be very, very harmful, sometimes leading to death.
Absolutely.
Yeah, this has just been so fascinating. Maya, last question for you. And I know you might not want to answer, and that's okay. But when you think about this work that you've done in this publication, it's in print, other people now are learning from it. Where would you like to go from here? Like, I'm sure researching and writing this paper opened up a whole other set of doors in your head about what might interest you in learning more. So we know that when you write a paper like this, there's so much more behind each of these elements. So what would you like to do moving forward with the things that you learned in researching this paper?
Yeah, well, I think a few things. And I mean, regardless of whether or not I'm the person doing them, I think the things that sort of need to be. Yeah. So something that really stood out to me was within the research that exists about racial discrimination within healthcare systems, within Canada, it's actually really limited. Most of the research is really new. And that research, rightfully so, focuses on Indigenous peoples. And now within the last year, thankfully, because of that research, these issues have become more apparent. But in Canada, there's a general gap in race-based data generally. So specifically, Black Canadians, data on their experiences within school, within healthcare, within all these things is really, really lacking.
Right.
So in Canada, and that's an issue because it contributes to Canadians' beliefs that, okay, this isn't an issue in our country, this isn't really happening. Black people aren't experiencing the same experiences other people of color or Indigenous people on on the whole, like there just needs to be more race-based data in order to allow for people to really understand the issues as they stand within Canada.
Yeah.
So it's certainly something that needs to be done. And then also, I think just, making information accessible. Like, to be honest, this paper I did, because it was originally for like a third or fourth year soci class, there is a lot of academic jargon. I'm not gonna lie, it's not that accessible. I'm happy it's great to do this interview because it allows them to make it.
And that's
accessible.
one of the reasons we did want to do the interview. And I think that is, if I might say, one of the failings of academic journals
Totally, yeah.
or professional journals overall, is that they're often not open access. This one is. And they're written at a postgraduate level of language. And so you lose the vast majority of readers. So the knowledge gets locked up. That's how I view it. It's like under lock and key.
No, definitely. And I think, like, in addition to that, not just getting it accessible to patients, obviously that's really important, but also really making sure that this information is within the center of medicine, within the center of medical institutions and medical schools. And, it is being more so, which is so good. We're seeing way more focus on it. I think that healthcare still focuses on a biomedical model, which means that it's focusing on what's going on inside people's bodies, biological processes. And in that, what's often missed is what's going on outside of the body, which includes discrimination within interactions with healthcare providers and structural inequalities and all these things.
All of those things that are social determinants of health.
Exactly.
I think, as you know, Maya, one of the ways we are trying to help address these things is to talk about them in hopefully lay friendly ways, reader friendly ways, through our publications and through the Health Inequity series that you helped us get off the ground and has been so well received by our readers. So we want to thank you so much for your time. We miss you so much on a daily basis in the shop, so to speak. But just love to see this work that you've had published, and massive congratulations to you. And we just look forward to reading more papers and seeing your star rise into the sky. So bless you, little one, for coming and for doing all this great work. We're very, very appreciative.
Thank you.
And we'll see you again on our next episode of Arthritis at Home. Bye, everyone.